She rolled into that boardroom in a wheelchair, dressed in a $12,000 suit, holding a company worth more than most countries' defense budgets, and they still looked at her like she was something broken that needed to be swept off the floor. They called her damaged. They called her a liability. One of them actually laughed. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody said a word. Nobody except the mechanic with grease still under his fingernails. If you want to know what real strength looks like this video, drop your city in the comments, and don't you dare leave before the end. The morning Evelyn Sterling returned to Titan Forge Industries, the sky over the city was the color of old iron. Low clouds pressing down like a fist, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier than it already was. Nolan Cross noticed it from underneath a hydraulic press assembly on the third bay floor, his back flat against the concrete, a socket wrench in one hand and a flashlight clamp between his teeth. He'd been there since 5:40 in the morning, not because anyone asked him to come in early, just because the press had been throwing error codes all week, and the technician who was supposed to diagnose it had called out sick, and if it sat idle another shift the machining floor would fall behind, and 23 people would hear about it from their floor supervisors at the end of the day. Nolan had learned a long time ago that most problems don't wait for convenient hours. He was 35 years old, and he looked it, not in a beaten way, but in the way of a man who had spent most of his adult life doing physical things in difficult conditions and had stopped pretending that didn't leave marks. There was a scar running along the left side of his jaw that he rarely explained. His hands were large and consistently dirty, no matter how well he scrubbed them after a shift. He drove a 2009 pickup truck with a cracked passenger side mirror he kept meaning to replace, and he kept a second set of work clothes in his locker because his daughter, Maya, sometimes spilled breakfast on the first set during their morning rush, and he'd learned to plan for that. Maya was 8. She was in the 3rd grade and had recently decided she wanted to be either an astronaut or a veterinarian, and most evenings Nolan listened to her explain the pros and cons of each path with the seriousness of someone negotiating a contract. He was the only parent she had. He tried not to think about that too hard most days. He thought about it anyway. Titan Forge Industries occupied a converted industrial campus on the eastern edge of the city. 4 buildings connected by enclosed walkways, a testing facility behind chain-link fence, and a parking structure that always smelled faintly of machine oil no matter how much they cleaned it. The company built precision components for defense contractors. Specialized gear housings, hydraulic control systems, parts so specific and difficult to manufacture that only a handful of facilities in the country could produce them to spec. It was not a glamorous business. The lobby had a marble floor that nobody needed and a reception desk staffed by a woman named Doris, who had been there longer than half the current executive roster. But the work was real, and the tolerances were tight, and Nolan had spent 5 years learning every machine in the facility the way he once learned terrain, by feel, by instinct, by walking the same ground until it stopped being unfamiliar. He'd come here after leaving a life he didn't talk about. He didn't advertise what he'd done before. His personnel file said 8 years U.S. Navy, honorable discharge. It didn't say the rest of it. Most people assumed he'd been a technician of some kind, maybe an engineer. He let them assume it was easier. He slid out from under the press assembly a few minutes before 7, wiped his face with the back of his forearm, and sat on the concrete floor for a moment looking at the diagnostic readout on his tablet. The fault was in the pressure sensor relay, a $12 part that had been misread as a software error by the automated system. He'd have it fixed before the first production shift started. He marked the work order, stood, and went to find the part. He was in the parts cage when Marcus Dill, one of the second shift supervisors, came through the bay door with the particular expression of someone who had information they were trying not to look too interested in sharing. "Sterling's back today," Marcus said. Nolan didn't look up from the bin of pressure sensor components. "I heard." "Board meeting, first one since the accident." Nolan found the relay, checked the model number against his notes, and set it on the counter. "You need something from the cage, or are you just doing laps?" Marcus leaned against the door frame. He was a good supervisor. Organized, fair, didn't yell. He was also constitutionally incapable of not discussing whatever the current company drama was. "I'm just saying, there's talk, among the executive floor, about whether she can still run the place." "People talk about a lot of things." "Nolan, she's been out 6 months, spinal injury. She's in a wheelchair now. The guy's up on 12. Marcus lowered his voice by about half a register. I heard Garrett and Voss were saying she should step down voluntarily before the board has to ask her. Nolan set the relay part in his breast pocket and looked at Marcus directly for the first time since the conversation started. Garrett and Voss run a defense components company, not a hospital. What she can or can't do from a wheelchair is a medical question, not a business one. I'm not saying I agree with them. I know you're not. Nolan picked up his tools. I've got a press to fix before first shift. He meant it as an ending to the conversation, and Marcus seemed to understand that, stepping aside to let him through. But as Nolan walked back across the bay floor, the information sat somewhere in the back of his mind, quiet and patient the way things sat with him when they mattered. He'd never met Evelyn Sterling. She had been running Titan Forge for 2 years before the accident that changed things. A car collision on the interstate, a spinal cord injury at the T10 vertebra, 6 months of hospitalization and rehabilitation that had kept her out of the building entirely. Nolan knew her mostly by reputation and by the secondhand fragments that filtered down from the executive floors to the shop floor, which was the usual path of information in any large company. She was 30 years old. She had taken over from her father's business partner when the founder retired, and the board needed someone who understood the company's contracts and its engineering well enough to keep clients from walking. She apparently did. Revenue had grown 18% in her first year. Nolan knew that because Marcus had mentioned it once, and Nolan had filed it away the way he filed most things. Not for use, just because he noticed it. He fixed the press in 40 minutes. The first production shift came in at 8. By 8:15, the bay was running, and Nolan was already on his second problem of the morning, a coolant line on one of the milling machines that had developed a slow weep somewhere behind the housing. He didn't think about Evelyn Sterling again until 11:20, when everything in the building went briefly and inexplicably quiet. It started near the executive elevators on the east side of the building. Nolan was passing through the second-floor corridor with a toolbox when he heard it. Not a single sound, but the absence of several. The kind of collective held breath that happens in open-plan buildings when something is happening that people don't know how to react to. He stopped. Down the corridor, near the elevator bank that connected to the executive conference suites on 12, a small crowd of office staff had gathered at what they probably thought was a discreet distance. Some of them had their phones out. A few were just staring. Nobody was doing anything useful. Nolan set his toolbox down and moved toward the elevator bank. The elevator doors were open. Evelyn Sterling was inside it, in her wheelchair, and the threshold between the elevator car and the corridor floor had a lip, a small one, maybe 3/4 of an inch, that should have been beveled down to a smooth ramp according to accessibility code. It wasn't. The building had been retrofitted years ago, imperfectly, and apparently nobody on the facilities side had caught this particular threshold in the compliance review. Evelyn had the front wheels of her chair against it and was trying to navigate the angle with the quiet, precise effort of someone who was not going to ask for help if she could possibly manage without it. She was managing. It was working. But it was taking longer than it should, and the reason Nolan kept moving was not because she was failing. It was because of the 2 men standing 15 feet away from the elevator, watching her. He recognized both of them from the third-floor directories. Richard Garrett, Executive VP of Operations, mid-50s, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore his suits as though they were armor. And Paul Voss, Chief Legal Officer, early 50s, with the patient, pleasant expression of someone who had learned to smile while meaning something entirely different. They were watching Evelyn struggle with the threshold, and they were not moving. They were also talking to each other in low voices, not quite low enough. 6 months, Voss said. And this is the entrance she makes. Garrett made a small sound, not quite a laugh. If she can't get herself through a doorway, I don't know how we explain her to the Hargrove delegates next month. Nolan walked past both of them without acknowledging that he'd heard anything, moved to the elevator, and positioned himself beside the chair with one hand on the push handle. Ma'am, mind if I help with this threshold? Building should have had it ramped years ago. Facilities oversight. He said it matter-of-factly, not as an apology, not as a commentary on her ability, just as what it was, which was a building deficiency that someone was going to hear about before the end of the day. Evelyn Sterling looked up at him. She had dark eyes that were sharper than he expected, and an expression that he couldn't immediately read, which was unusual for him. She was younger looking in person than the company headshot on the directory, and her suit, charcoal, well cut, was the kind that said she had dressed carefully and deliberately for today, which told him something about the weight she'd given this morning. "I have it," she said. Her voice was level. "I know you do," he said. "I'm asking to help with the building's mistake, not yours." A pause. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. "All right," she said. He guided the chair over the threshold cleanly, no drama, no fuss, just the small corrective tilt and forward motion that the obstacle required. The crowd in the corridor that had been watching dispersed back toward their workstations with the particular efficiency of people pretending they'd been doing something else the whole time. Garrett watched Nolan for a moment with an expression that was difficult to parse. Voss had already looked away. "Thank you," Evelyn said when they were clear of the elevator. "I'll put in a facilities ticket for that threshold this afternoon," Nolan said, and picked up his toolbox from where he'd set it down. "Should have been done a long time ago." He started to walk away. He wasn't trying to make an impression. He had a coolant line to diagnose. "I don't think I know you," Evelyn said behind him. He turned back. "Nolan Cross, head mechanic, third bay." She regarded him with that same sharp, assessing quality. "You've been here long?" "5 years." "And you just happened to be walking by." "I was on my way to a milling machine," he said. "Coolant leak." She held his gaze for another second and then nodded once, with the faint ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the territory. "Get back to your leak, Mr. Cross." He did. He found out later from Marcus that the board meeting that afternoon had been something close to catastrophic. Not the kind of catastrophe that involved shouting. Garrett and Voss were too calculated for that. The kind that involved precise, civil, devastating questions about cognitive load, executive continuity, and the company's obligations to its shareholders during what they kept calling a period of medical uncertainty. The kind where nobody said anything directly cruel, but every sentence was engineered to reach the same destination. Evelyn had been in that room for 90 minutes, and when it was over, she had been the one proposing an interim review committee, which, Marcus said, was basically handing a knife to someone while they were explaining to the room that you shouldn't have knives. Nolan heard this while eating lunch at his workbench, a habit he'd developed because the break room was too loud for his preference. He ate without responding and thought about the two men by the elevator that morning, the sound of Voss's voice, the particular quality of Garrett's expression. He thought about what it took to stand in a room with people like that, to hold your ground, to refuse to let the pressure show. He went back to work. At 3:40, Evelyn's assistant, a young man named Theo, who always looked slightly overwhelmed, appeared at the entrance to the third bay with the expression of someone who had been sent somewhere they weren't sure they were supposed to go. He found Nolan replacing a coolant coupling on the far milling machine. "Ms. Sterling asked me to find you," Theo said. He was holding a small envelope. "She asked me to give you this." Nolan wiped his hands and took it. Inside was a business card, Evelyn's, and on the back, in precise angular handwriting, "Thank you for treating a threshold like a threshold. E.S." He looked at it for a moment, put it in his shirt pocket, went back to work. He picked up Maya from the after-school program at 5:15. She climbed into the truck with her backpack and immediately launched into an explanation of why vet school was probably the harder path, but also probably more worth it. And Nolan listened and asked questions and drove home through the city's evening traffic with the kind of ordinary exhaustion that comes from a full day of physical work and the kind of quieter weight that comes from a day that had been more than just that. He made pasta for dinner. Maya set the table without being asked, which meant she was working up to a request. He'd learned to read the signs, and sure enough, halfway through the meal, she asked if they could get a fish. "One fish," she said seriously. "That's all, just one." "To practice for vet school?" "To practice for having a fish." He said he'd think about it. He always said he'd think about it. Most of the time, he eventually said yes. He put her to bed at 8:30, read half a chapter of the book she'd picked. Stayed in the doorway for a moment after she fell asleep the way parents do when the day has been long and the kid is finally still and the house is quiet enough to feel the size of it. Then he went to the kitchen table, pulled out Evelyn Sterling's business card, and set it in front of him. He didn't know why he kept thinking about those two men by the elevator. He'd spent years learning to read threat assessments in places where the stakes were categorically higher than a corporate conference room, and he knew that what he'd seen in Garrett's expression that morning was not contempt in the ordinary sense. It was the particular, settled confidence of someone who had already decided how something was going to end. He turned the card over, looked at the handwriting, put it back in his pocket. Outside, the city moved on through the night, indifferent and full of noise, and Nolan Cross sat at his kitchen table for a while longer, thinking about thresholds. The facilities ticket. Nolan submitted for the elevator threshold was closed the following morning with a notation that read, "Reviewed. No action required at this time." He stared at that line on his work terminal for about 4 seconds, then printed a copy, folded it, and put it in the same drawer where he kept his shift logs and his daughter's school permission slips, things that needed to exist on paper, in case someone later tried to say they didn't exist at all. He'd developed that habit a long time ago, in a different life, in places where the difference between what was documented and what was remembered could determine who came home. He wasn't in those places anymore, but the habit stayed. The week after the board meeting moved like most weeks at Titan Forge, loud in the machine bays, quieter on the upper floors, with the specific undercurrent of tension that large buildings carry when something unresolved is still working itself out behind closed doors. Nolan noticed it the way he noticed most things, not by looking directly at it, but by watching what moved around it. The executive assistant pool on the second floor had gotten quieter. Theo, Evelyn's assistant, looked like he'd stopped sleeping properly. 2 of the mid-level operations managers, decent men, both of them, the kind who remembered people's names, had started taking lunch at different times than usual, which in Nolan's experience meant they were either avoiding someone or being avoided. He kept his head down and did his job. He fixed a malfunctioning conveyor tensioner on Bay 2. He recalibrated a grinding unit that had been throwing tolerance deviations for 3 weeks because the person assigned to it had been adjusting the wrong variable. He picked Maya up from school. He made dinner. He listened to her read aloud from a library book about deep-sea animals and answered her questions about anglerfish with the careful honesty they deserved, including the part that was genuinely disturbing, which she found delightful. On Thursday of that week, the first thing that didn't add up showed itself quietly, the way first things usually do. He was doing a walkthrough of the East Wing service corridor, a routine he'd established after a condensation leak the previous winter had gone unnoticed for 6 weeks and damaged a section of electrical conduit, when he noticed the wheelchair lift at the east stairwell was showing a service light. He checked the panel. The lift had been manually disabled, not malfunctioning. Disabled via a code entry override that required an authorized facilities keycard. He pulled the access log. The override had been entered at 6:47 the previous evening, after most of the building had cleared out, under a facilities keycard registered to a man named Denny Pruitt, a maintenance contractor who'd left Titan Forge's employ 4 months ago. Nolan stood in the service corridor for a moment, looking at the log screen. A former employee's keycard, still active in the system, used after hours to disable a lift that served the one floor Evelyn Sterling's office was on. It could have been a system error. Card deactivations sometimes didn't propagate properly through older access systems. He'd seen it happen. It could have been coincidence. He took a photo of the log screen with his phone. He re-enabled the lift manually. He submitted a separate ticket flagging the active card as a security anomaly, and he filed it under his own name rather than routing it through the facility's supervisor, because he wanted to know if this one got closed without action too. It did. 48 hours later, the ticket status read reviewed. Access log discrepancy attributed to software migration artifact. Card deactivated. He printed that one too. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. There was no version of that conversation that went well. He was a mechanic, not security, not HR, not anyone whose instincts about access logs and disabled lifts would be received as anything other than overreach. And he might still be wrong. He needed more than 2 data points before he started treating coincidence as pattern. That was something he'd learned the hard way, in circumstances he didn't think about at work. The second data point came 6 days later. One of the younger machinists, a kid named Rubio who worked Bay 4 and kept a photo of his dog on his locker door, came to find Nolan during the afternoon shift with his phone half extended, the particular body language of someone who wants to show you something but isn't sure if they should. "You're going to think I'm dumb for bringing this to you," Rubio said. "I probably won't," Nolan said. Rubio turned the phone over. It was a screenshot of a social media post, anonymous account, throwaway handle, that had been shared across several industry forums in the past 12 hours. The post contained a video clip, roughly 40 seconds long, shot from what looked like a ceiling-mounted camera angle inside a rehabilitation facility. It showed a woman in a wheelchair attempting to transfer herself from the chair to a parallel bar apparatus, losing her grip partway through and sliding to the floor. It showed the difficulty of getting back up. It showed a physical therapist arriving to help and the patient's expression. Exhausted, frustrated, the specific private face of effort that nobody wants witnessed. The woman in the video was Evelyn Sterling. The caption on the post read, "Is this the person supposed to be running a billion-dollar defense company, asking for the shareholders?" Nolan looked at the screen for a long moment. He noticed his jaw had tightened. He made it stop. "How wide is this spreading?" he asked. "It's already on 2 industry forums and somebody reposted it on the company's public review page," Rubio said. He was clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know if anyone told her. I'll make sure someone does." Nolan handed the phone back. "Don't share it. Don't comment on it. Just let it sit." Rubio nodded, relieved to have handed the problem to someone else. Nolan thought about that video for the rest of his shift. Not about the cruelty of it, though that was there. The deliberate selection of a private moment, the framing designed to humiliate rather than inform. He was thinking about logistics. A rehabilitation facility had its own camera system, separate from Titan Forge's network. Getting that footage out required either access to the facility's system or someone inside it. It required knowing where Evelyn received therapy. It required timing and intention and a willingness to go outside company walls to find material to use against her. This was not a few executives airing grievances in a board meeting. This was organized. He drove home that evening with that thought sitting in the passenger seat, heavy and specific. Maya was at the kitchen table when he came in, doing homework, her tongue pressed to the corner of her lip the way it did when she was concentrating. She looked up and said, "We had a substitute today who didn't know what the equator was." "What did you do?" I told her, quietly. She considered. She didn't seem very grateful. People sometimes aren't when you know something they don't. "That's dumb," Maya said. "Yeah," he agreed. He went to wash his hands. "It really is." He thought about calling someone. He'd kept most of his contacts from before, not actively, not as a network he cultivated, but the numbers existed and some of them still answered. There were people he could ask about security threats, about how you'd go about getting surveillance footage out of a private medical facility, about what the architecture of a campaign like this would look like. But calling in those contacts meant acknowledging, at least to himself, that this had moved past a pair of data points. He wasn't there yet. Not quite. He got there the following Tuesday. He'd come in early again, not unusual, and was crossing through the parking structure on his way to the east building entrance when he noticed Evelyn's vehicle. It was a modified sedan with hand controls, dark blue, parked in the designated accessible space nearest the building entrance. She'd apparently been coming in early herself for the past week, which he'd learned from Theo, who mentioned it with the exhausted pride of someone who admired a person and worried about them at the same time. What he noticed was not the car. What he noticed was the camera. The parking structure had 4 security cameras covering the accessible spaces. Standard installation, positions he'd noted months ago during a facilities review that he'd been asked to participate in because of a question about power conduit routing. Camera 3, which had the clearest angle on the accessible space where Evelyn's car was parked, was positioned at a slight downward tilt that was different from the last time he'd looked at it. Not dramatically different, a few degrees, the kind of adjustment that might happen from vibration or maintenance or the ordinary settling of a mount over time. Except he'd looked at that camera 9 days ago, and the angle had been clean. He remembered because he'd filed the facilities review with camera positions noted, and he remembered things like that. He went to the security booth at the parking structure entrance. The overnight guard, an older man named Chet, who drank too much coffee and kept a crossword book under the counter, was halfway through a puzzle. "Morning, Chet. Camera 3 in the accessible section. When did maintenance last touch the mount?" Chet checked the log without question, because Nolan asked about facilities equipment regularly enough that it wasn't strange. "Doesn't show a maintenance entry. Can you pull the last 48 hours of footage from camera 3? Chet looked up. "For what?" "Mount might be loose," Nolan said. "I want to see if it shifted or if someone adjusted it." Chet shrugged and pulled it up on the secondary monitor. They watched 2 days of parking structure footage on fast forward, and at 11:14 p.m. 2 nights ago, a figure in a gray hooded jacket spent approximately 40 seconds near camera 3's mounting post before walking away with the particular unhurried pace of someone trying not to look like they'd just done something. The figure's face was never visible. After camera 3, the angle had shifted just enough that the accessible parking space was no longer in clean view. It still showed the general area. It just didn't show the specific space, or who parked there, or whether anything happened to a vehicle in that space when the building was quiet. "Chet," Nolan said, "I need you to save that clip and don't delete it for any reason. And if anyone asks you to delete it or tells you the system auto-purged it, I need you to call me directly." He wrote his cell number on a sticky note. "Don't route it through the facility's request system. Call me." Chet looked at the sticky note and then at Nolan with the expression of someone who had just become aware that the morning had gotten considerably more complicated than his crossword puzzle. "Should I be worried about something?" "Not yet," Nolan said. "I'll let you know." He got to his bay, set down his toolbox, and stood at his workbench for a moment with his hands flat on the steel surface. The kind of deliberate stillness he used when he needed to think without his body getting in the way of it. 3 incidents. A disabled lift, accessed with a dead employee's card. A rehabilitation video, sourced from outside the company. A surveillance camera, manually adjusted to blind spot an executive's parking space. None of them catastrophic on their own. All of them pointed in the same direction, toward the same person, with the same intent, to make Evelyn Sterling's environment progressively less safe, while ensuring that nothing could be traced easily to anyone with a name and a job title on the 12th floor. Whoever was doing this was patient. They were using contractors, dead credentials, figures in gray jackets and parking structures at 11 p.m. They were working around the company's own systems, which meant they understood those systems, which meant they were inside, or had been. This was not a group of executives hoping she'd resign under pressure. This was something that had a plan. He thought about Evelyn Sterling in that boardroom, 90 minutes of organized civil dismantling. He thought about the video of her on the floor of a rehabilitation facility and the specific deliberateness of sharing it. He thought about a surveillance camera tilted by a few degrees in the middle of the night. He picked up his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't used in 2 years. The name in the contact was just initials, DR. He stared at it for a moment, then put the phone back down. Not yet. He needed to be smarter than reactive. He needed to talk to Evelyn Sterling. That was easier decided than done. He was not someone who walked into the executive suite. He had no credibility in that space, no title, no standing. He was the head mechanic from Bay 3 who had helped her over a threshold once and received a handwritten thank you card. If he went to her with what he had, a photo of an access log, a video of a man in a gray jacket, some disabled equipment, she'd either dismiss it or, worse, have it forwarded to the very people he was concerned about. He needed to be careful about the path in. The path appeared unexpectedly on Friday afternoon. Theo appeared at the bay entrance again, this time looking less overwhelmed than purposeful. He found Nolan at the workbench and stopped at a respectful distance, which Nolan had noticed was a habit of his. Theo always stopped at a distance that communicated he understood he was on someone else's floor. "Ms. Sterling asked if you'd have a few minutes," Theo said. "She's doing a facilities walkthrough and wanted to ask about the East Building Service corridors. Something about the ramp compliance review you submitted." Nolan set down the caliper he was using. "When?" "Now, if you're able." He was able. He found her in the East Building corridor near the second-floor service junction, in her chair, with a printed document on her lap that turned out to be a copy of his original threshold ticket and the closed without action response. She looked up when he came around the corner, and her expression had the same quality it had the first time he'd seen her up close. Direct, assessing, not hostile, but not warm either, like someone who'd learned that warmth was a resource to be managed. "Your facilities ticket," she said, holding it up slightly. "The threshold." "Someone closed it without action," he said. "I kept a copy." "I see that. Why did you keep a copy?" "Because it was a real problem, and closing it without action doesn't make it not a real problem. It just means someone chose not to fix it." She looked at him for a moment. "You do that with a lot of things? Keep copies?" "When I think they'll matter later." Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, just the small recalibration of someone updating an assessment. She gestured with the document toward the corridor. "I'm looking at the service access points on this floor. I've been told they're compliant. I want to see for myself." "That's probably smart," he said. "Walk with me." They moved through the corridor together, Evelyn navigating her chair with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from months of living inside that particular reality, and Nolan walking beside her, pointing out the issues without editorializing. The uneven joint where the East Junction met the elevator lobby, the door threshold near the server room that had the same lip as the one he'd filed the ticket on, the section of corridor where overhead pipe maintenance had required a temporary ramp that had since been removed but not replaced with the permanent solution it was supposed to be replaced with. "When was the temporary ramp removed?" Evelyn asked. 3 weeks ago, he said. "And the permanent solution?" "Hasn't been scheduled." She wrote something on the document in her lap. He noticed she held the pen slightly differently than most people, a grip accommodation for limited reach, he guessed, from the injury. And she wrote fast, not neatly, the handwriting of someone who was taking real notes rather than performing the act of taking notes. "The ticket on the threshold," she said, without looking up. "Who closed it?" "Facilities supervisor, routed through the standard system." "And the service lift on this floor. I heard there was a service issue recently." He looked at her. She was still writing, but she'd stopped, pen on paper, waiting. "There was," he said carefully. "It was manually disabled after hours." "By whom?" "According to the access log, by a contractor who hasn't worked here in 4 months." She looked up then. Her eyes were very still. "You checked the access log. I was nearby. The service light was on. That's not why you checked it." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "It's not." The corridor was quiet around them. Somewhere below, the muffled rhythm of the machine bays continued. The press, the grinders, the ordinary percussion of the building's real work. Up here, it was just the two of them, and the fluorescent lights and whatever was in the space between what he'd said and what he hadn't said yet. "Mr. Cross?" Evelyn said. Her voice was even. "What else have you noticed?" He told her. Not everything. Not the contact in his phone, not the full shape of the thing as he'd been assembling it, because he didn't have the full shape yet, and presenting a partial picture as a complete one was a mistake he'd been trained out of a long time ago. But he told her about the access log, about the parking camera, about Rubio's screenshot and the rehabilitation video that was still circulating on forums, about the pattern of small events that individually looked like negligence or coincidence and together looked like neither. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. Some people interrupted to show they were following. She listened to actually follow. When he finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. She looked at a point in the middle distance, the document still in her lap, the pen capped. He could see the work happening behind her eyes. Not panic, not disbelief, but the precise and slightly exhausting recalibration of someone who had suspected something without quite letting themselves confirm it and was now confirming it. "The video," she said finally. "I didn't know it had been shared that widely. It's been pulled from the company's review page, Purse," he said. "But it's still on the forums." "Of course it is." A pause. "That footage was from my facility. Private facility. There are maybe 6 people outside my own medical team who even know where I do my therapy." "I know." She looked at him then, directly, and this time the expression was something he recognized. The particular face of someone who had just understood that the scope of a problem was larger than its visible surface. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "You're a mechanic. This isn't your problem." "I work in this building," he said. "Everything that happens in this building is my problem, one way or another." She held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. "Is that the real reason?" He considered lying or deflecting. He'd had practice at both. He didn't. "I watched two men stand 15 feet from you and do nothing while you dealt with a threshold they could have helped with in 2 seconds," he said. "And I watched them talk about you while they were doing it. That's enough reason." Evelyn Sterling looked at him for a long time. She wasn't softening, exactly. It was more like she was deciding something. "I don't want this reported through official channels," she said. "Not yet. Not until I understand who's in those channels." "That's smart." "I want copies of everything you have." "You'll have them by end of day." She nodded. She started moving her chair back toward the elevator, then stopped, without turning back. "The lift. The one that was disabled. Is it working now?" "I re-enabled it the same morning," he said, and submitted the access log anomaly, which was closed without action, which I have a printed copy of, he said. This time, the sound she made was almost a laugh. Dry, involuntary, the kind that escapes when something is too accurately grim to respond to any other way. She didn't say anything else. She wheeled to the elevator and pressed the call button and waited, and Nolan watched her for a moment before turning to go back to his bay. He had the copies on her desk through Theo before 4 p.m. He drove home. He picked up Maya, who announced that she had decided fish were boring and she wanted a turtle instead. "What happened to the fish?" he asked. "Fish don't have personalities," she said, with the absolute conviction of someone who had clearly given this serious thought. "Turtles have personalities." "How do you know that?" "Connor's turtle at school bit the vet," she said. "That's a personality." He drove the rest of the way home and thought about Evelyn Sterling and the access logs and the gray-jacketed figure on the parking structure camera, and about the quiet, specific patience of people who believed they were untouchable. He thought, they usually believed that right up until they weren't. He said nothing about any of it. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He read until Maya fell asleep, and then he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and pulled out his phone and looked at the contact labeled DR for a long time. Then he put the phone face down on the table and went to get a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark street and let himself think carefully about what came next. The contact labeled DR in Nolan's phone was a man named Devin Rask, and Nolan finally called him on a Sunday evening while Maya was in the bath, the bathroom door closed, the sound of her narrating an elaborate story involving a rubber duck, and what appeared to be a submarine rescue operation providing enough background noise to cover a conversation he didn't want her to accidentally hear. Rask picked up on the second ring, which was typical. He'd always picked up fast. It was a reflex from years of being someone people called when things had already gone wrong and were getting worse. "Cross," Rask said. "Not a question, just the word, like a confirmation." "I need a favor," Nolan said. "Information, not action." "Those are usually the same thing with you." "Not this time." He kept it brief. The access logs, the camera, the rehabilitation footage, the pattern of it. He didn't editorialize. He gave Rask the shape of it and let him look at it. There was a pause on the other end that meant Rask was doing exactly that. "You think it's internal?" "Multiple people. One of them has reach outside the building. The medical facility breach, that's not someone winging it." "How many incidents total?" 6 confirmed. Probably more I haven't found yet." Another pause. "You want me to look at the financial background on the executives?" "I want to know if there's a money trail that explains why removing her is worth this much effort." "That's not just information, Nolan. That's a thread." "I know what it is," Nolan said. "I'm not asking you to pull it. Just tell me if it's there." Rask was quiet for a moment longer. From the bathroom came the sound of Maya making explosion noises, which apparently the submarine rescue had taken a turn. "Give me 4 days," Rask said. "And you owe me a real conversation at some point. The kind where you actually answer questions." "Maybe," Nolan said and hung up. He didn't hear from Rask for 5 days, which wasn't unusual. Rask worked in the space between official channels and the places official channels couldn't see, and he operated on his own clock. In those 5 days, Nolan kept his routines, kept his head at the right angle, and watched the building the way he'd learned to watch terrain. Not staring at it, but seeing it, peripherally and completely, the way you had to, when you couldn't afford to miss things. What he noticed during those 5 days was that the nature of the incidents had changed. The earlier ones had been infrastructural. The lift, the camera, things built into the building that could be adjusted invisibly. The new pattern was interpersonal, and that meant it had escalated. 2 board members who'd previously been neutral on the question of Evelyn's leadership had stopped returning her calls, according to Theo, who mentioned it in the way of someone who didn't know he was confirming a pattern Nolan was already tracking. A shareholder letter had circulated, anonymous, distributed through a third-party investor forum, questioning whether Titan Forge's insurance premiums would rise due to what it called leadership continuity risk. The language was corporate and bloodless and precise in the way that deliberate cruelty tends to be when it's been edited by someone careful. And on Wednesday of that week, Evelyn's car had a flat tire in the parking structure, a nail lodged in the rear driver's side. She had a roadside service, it was handled, nobody reported it as anything other than ordinary bad luck. Nolan looked at the tire when the service truck was packing up, looked at the angle of the nail, straight in, not at the road entry angle that a driven-over nail would produce, and didn't say anything to the service technician because there was nothing useful to say to the service technician. He took a photo. He put it with the others. Thursday morning, Rask texted a single word, "Call me." Nolan called from the parking structure stairwell during his break, standing 2 flights up from the ground level, voice low. "The 2 executives you mentioned, Garrett and Voss," Rask said. "Garrett is clean on paper. Voss is cleaner on paper, which, in my experience, means he's better at paperwork." "What's underneath it?" 3 years ago, before Sterling took over, Titan Forge was running a materials procurement arrangement with a supplier called Vexlar Components. The arrangement had some creative accounting in it, cost overruns attributed to R&D that don't match the actual R&D expenditure. Small enough per quarter to avoid automatic flags. Big enough over 3 years to add up to somewhere north of $11 million. Nolan was quiet. Sterling's first year, Rask continued, she restructured the procurement chain. Vexlar lost the contract. The creative accounting stops appearing in the quarterly reports, which suggests she either found it or was about to find it. And Voss is connected to Vexlar. His brother-in-law sits on the Vexlar board, which is a matter of public record that nobody happened to connect until I looked. Garrett? Garrett received 2 consulting payments from a holding company that shares a registered address with one of Vexlar's subsidiary shells. Again, public record, different databases. Not something that appears unless someone's specifically looking. The stairwell was cold and smelled of concrete and the faint chemical ghost of industrial cleaner. Nolan leaned against the wall and looked at nothing. $11 million over 3 years. A CEO who restructured the procurement chain her first year, possibly without knowing exactly what she'd disrupted. A campaign to remove her that had been running, he now understood, since probably her 2nd month in the role. "Rask," he said. "If she keeps digging, if she finds the Vexlar connection, then they've already made their choice," Rask said, "about how far they're willing to go." He said it flatly, the way you said things that were true and uncomfortable and didn't need decoration. Nolan had heard that particular register of voice before, in different places, under different circumstances, and he'd learned to take it seriously. "Thanks," he said. "Be careful, Nolan." A pause. "And I mean that in the specific way, not the general way." He understood the distinction. He went back to his bay and he spent the afternoon working and thinking with the same part of his brain, which he'd always been able to do. Physical work and analytical work didn't compete with each other the way people assumed. He needed to get the information to Evelyn, and he needed to do it in a way that protected the source without undermining the information, and he needed her to understand that this had shifted from harassment to something that required a fundamentally different response. He got to Theo just before 4. "I need 10 minutes with Ms. Sterling. Tonight if possible, tomorrow morning at the latest." Theo looked at him and clearly read something in his face because he didn't ask what it was about. I'll let her know. Evelyn's response came back in 20 minutes. After hours, East Conference Room B, 6:30. He sent Maya to spend the evening with their neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, who kept excellent snacks and let Maya watch nature documentaries past her usual bedtime, an arrangement Maya was always enthusiastic about. He told Mrs. Calloway he'd be back by 8. He was not sure that was true. Conference Room B on the East Wing second floor was a smaller room, a working room rather than an impression room. A table with 8 chairs, a whiteboard, windows that faced the parking structure rather than the city. Evelyn was already there when he arrived, her chair at the head of the table, a tablet, and a legal pad in front of her. She'd clearly been working late. Her jacket was over the back of a chair, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbows in the way of someone who'd been at it for hours. Theo was also there, standing near the door, and Nolan noted that without commenting on it. She'd brought a witness. That was smart. He sat across from her and walked her through it. Rask's findings, structured carefully, sources not named but the information itself presented cleanly, the way he'd learned to present intelligence, what was confirmed, what was inferred, what the gap between confirmed and inferred still contained. Evelyn listened the way she had in the corridor. Still, attentive, nothing on her face that she hadn't decided to put there. When he finished, she looked at the legal pad in front of her where she'd been making notes, and she didn't say anything for a long enough moment that Theo shifted his weight near the door. 11 million, she said finally, not to either of them specifically. Just the number, laid out. Possibly more, Nolan said. That's what's visible in public records. Internal financials would show the full picture. I restructured Vexler out of the procurement chain 14 months ago, she said. I thought it was an efficiency issue. The margins on their components were inconsistent, and the delivery timelines were unreliable. I didn't look further than that. They didn't know that, he said, or they weren't sure. She looked at him. They assumed I knew. They assumed you were about to find out, which is close enough to knowing from their perspective. She set her pen down carefully, precisely, the way she did most physical things. How long do you think this has been planned? The infrastructure of it. The access credentials, the external contacts, the shareholder letters through third-party channels, that took months to set up. I think they started building the scaffolding before your accident. The word accident sat in the room between them. He hadn't meant anything by it beyond the literal usage, but he watched her register it with the slight change of someone adjusting to a weight they were used to adjusting to. You think the accident, she began. I don't know, he said. And he meant it. I don't have anything that connects it. I'm not saying it. I'm saying everything else was already in motion. She nodded slowly. She looked at the window for a moment, at the dark glass and the lights of the parking structure beyond it. Then she looked back at him with an expression that was very tired and very clear-eyed at the same time. What do you think I should do? She asked. He appreciated that she asked it directly. I think you need to get someone with legal standing pulling the internal financial records before anyone on 12 realizes what's in them. And I think you need to do it fast. And I think you should assume that when they find out you're looking, the situation changes. Changes how? He was quiet for a moment. These are people who've been managing a significant financial crime for 3 years. They've already demonstrated they're willing to go outside the building, use third-party actors, compromise facilities' infrastructure. The logical endpoint of that progression isn't just embarrassing videos and tilted cameras. Theo, near the door, had gone very still. Evelyn held Nolan's gaze. You're saying they'd hurt me. I'm saying that when people with a lot to lose feel cornered, their choices stop being subtle. He kept his voice level, not because the conversation didn't matter, but because alarm served nothing here. I'm also saying that you're not without options. You have legal tools, you have board members who aren't Garrett and Voss, and you have what I've documented so far, which is more than you had a week ago. She looked at him steadily. And you? I'm a mechanic, he said. I fix things. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. I'm going to call my attorney tonight. If I move on the financial records, it'll take a minimum of 72 hours to structure it properly. Long enough for someone to notice that I'm doing it. Probably. Which means the window is narrow. Yes. She picked up her pen again. Made a note. Then she looked at him one more time, the look that he was coming to recognize as her version of taking a real measure of something. Mr. Cross, how did you learn to notice all of this? The cameras, the access logs, the tire. He held that question for a moment. I paid attention, he said. For a long time, in places where it mattered more than it does here, it's just a habit now. She didn't push. He appreciated that too. He got home by 8:15. Maya was still at Mrs. Calloway's, deep into a documentary about migratory birds that she apparently couldn't leave yet. He picked her up at 8:45 and carried her to the truck half asleep, and she said, with her eyes closed, "Albatrosses fly for years without landing." "Yeah?" he said. "I think that sounds lonely," she said, and was asleep before they got to the end of the block. He thought about that on the drive home. He thought about Evelyn in the conference room with the lights of the parking structure behind her, and $11 million sitting quiet and patient in a procurement chain that nobody was supposed to find. He thought about windows, how narrow they could get. The charity event that changed everything was announced 4 days later. It appeared in the company's internal communication as a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Hargrove Community Foundation, a charity affiliated with one of Titan Forge's largest defense clients, the kind of obligatory corporate goodwill event that populated executive calendars 3 or 4 times a year. The venue was the Meridian Tower, a glass and steel skyscraper on the city's east side that had been completed structurally but was still in the process of interior finishing, chosen, the announcement said, because the foundation's director wanted to showcase the building as a symbol of community investment, and the ceremony would be held on the 16th floor observation area. Nolan read the announcement on the company intranet during his lunch break and felt something cold and specific move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the bay, an unfinished building, an event on a high floor. Evelyn Sterling, whose wheelchair accessibility requirements had already been systematically undermined across her own building's infrastructure, now being invited to attend a ceremony in a construction zone with elevator systems that might or might not be fully operational, stairwells that were certainly not compliant, and an exit architecture that even a prepared and physically mobile person would find complex. He pulled up the Meridian Tower on the Public Construction Records database, a habit from his facilities work that had started being useful for entirely different reasons. The building had multiple elevator shafts, 2 operational passenger lifts installed and running, 2 more still awaiting inspection certification. The 16th floor was accessible by elevator, and the accessible elevator had a temporary certification pending final review scheduled for the following month. He noted the date of the event, Friday evening. He noted that the invitation specified a 6 p.m. arrival, with the ceremony running until 9. He noted that the event was positioned as a relationship event, important for the Hargrove contract renewal, the kind of event that a CEO, who was already fighting questions about her fitness to lead, could not easily decline without it becoming another data point in the narrative being built around her. He closed the database and sat at his workbench and thought, cleanly and without sentiment, about the geometry of it. On Thursday, the day before the event, he drove to the Meridian Tower on his lunch break and sat in his truck across the street looking at the building for about 10 minutes. Then he drove back to work and spent the afternoon finishing a bearing replacement on Bay 3's main lathe and thinking about 16 floors and elevator certifications and the quiet particular patience of men who had been planning something for a long time and were now arriving at the part they'd been building toward. That evening, he called Rask again. He kept it short. "Tomorrow night, event at the Meridian Tower. Evelyn Sterling will be there. I think it's a setup." Rask was quiet for 2 seconds. "What kind?" "I don't know exactly. I know the building well enough by now. I think I need to be inside." "Nolan, I'm not asking for backup," he said. "I'm telling you where I'll be in case that information becomes useful to someone later." A pause. "That's either very smart or very stupid." "It's both," Nolan said. "Usually is." He arranged for Maya to sleep at Mrs. Calloway's Friday night, which Maya accepted without much resistance because Mrs. Calloway had just gotten a streaming subscription that included 3 nature documentary series Maya had been wanting access to. He told Mrs. Calloway he had a work function. He told her not to wait up for him. Mrs. Calloway, who was 71 and had seen enough of the world to recognize when a person was telling her the important parts without telling her the important parts, said, "Be careful, Nolan," with a specific weight that suggested she was saying something more than the words. He wore dark work clothes Friday evening, the same kind he wore for late-night facility work. Nothing tactical about them, just practical, dark, heavy-duty fabric. He put his multi-tool on his belt. He put his phone in his breast pocket with the volume off. He drove to the Meridian Tower in his old pickup truck and parked on the service access road on the building's east side at 5:15 p.m., 45 minutes before the event was scheduled to begin, and he went in through the construction entrance, which was locked with a padlock that used a standard construction master key he'd carried on his ring for years because his work at Titan Forge occasionally required access to adjacent construction sites during facilities' infrastructure projects. The lobby smelled of fresh concrete and the particular chemical signature of new wiring. The two operational elevators were running, their doors propped open by rubber stops that indicated someone had been preparing the space. He took the stairs, the construction stairs, raw concrete, metal handrail, fine dust on every surface, up to the 16th floor, which took 4 minutes at a pace that didn't rush him but didn't waste time. The 16th floor observation area was a large open space with floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. A poured concrete floor, temporary lighting strung in careful arcs above that, gave the space an almost deliberate atmosphere. Unfinished but theatrical, the kind of space that event planners used when they wanted dramatic bones rather than polished walls. A catering setup was arranged near the south windows. A small podium stood at the north end. Folding chairs had been set up in 2 rows, and at the head of the arrangement, a clear space had been left, wide enough for a wheelchair, Nolan noticed, which meant someone had planned her presence carefully. He noted 3 things in the first 30 seconds. First, the 2 operational elevators were on this floor, doors still propped. The 3rd elevator, the accessible one with the pending certification, was on the south wall. Its call panel showed a ready indicator, green light, operational. Someone had activated it outside its certification timeline, which was either a paperwork oversight or a deliberate choice. Second, the construction access stairwell at the northeast corner of the floor had its door wedged closed with a rubber stop from the inside. That door opened outward. From inside the floor with the wedge in place, it wouldn't open. Third, the 2 men he could see moving around the catering setup were not catering staff. They moved differently. Not the practiced efficiency of people setting out food, but the deliberate route-checking movement of people learning a space. He moved back from the floor entrance and pressed himself against the stairwell wall and thought for exactly 4 seconds about what he was looking at and what it meant. The accessible elevator activated, green light, meaning Evelyn could get to this floor, meaning the event was proceeding and whoever had arranged this evening had made sure she could arrive. The stairwell blocked, meaning the primary non-elevator exit from the floor was compromised. 2 men learning the space, not security, not staff. And somewhere downstairs, in 40 minutes, Evelyn Sterling was going to arrive at this building in her dark blue sedan with the hand controls, dressed for a professional event, believing she was attending a charity ribbon cutting. He pulled out his phone and texted Evelyn directly. He had her number now, the direct line Theo had given him 2 weeks ago for exactly the kind of situation where routing through channels was not a viable option. "Don't come in yet. Wait in your car. I'm in the building. Call me in 10 minutes. He put the phone back in his pocket and started moving. The 2 men on the 16th floor were the ones he could see. He'd learned a long time ago that the ones he could see were almost never all of them. He went back down the construction stairs, carefully, no sound, the concrete absorbing his footfall cleanly, and checked floors 15 and 17, the 2 most logical support positions if you were staging something in an unfamiliar high-rise with multiple access routes. Floor 15 had 1 man. Near the south window, far side of the floor, phone in hand, facing the street. Floor 17 had the elevator mechanical room, which accessed the shaft controls for all 4 elevator shafts. Its door was unlocked and standing slightly open. He looked at it from the stairwell entrance for a moment without going in. The elevator shaft controls were in there. The certified accessible elevator on 16, the one that would bring Evelyn up and theoretically bring her back down, had its machinery in there. He understood the shape of it then, completely. She would arrive. She would take the accessible elevator to 16. The elevator would be disabled from the mechanical room on 17. The stairwell exit would be blocked. The two men on 16 would handle whatever came next in an unfinished building with no working cameras. The construction site camera system was not yet connected to the municipal network, a fact he'd confirmed from the public construction records, and no civilian witnesses because the real catering staff, if there had ever been real catering staff, were apparently not here. The entire Hargrove Foundation event was a construction, a set, built around one woman's wheelchair, around the reasonable and documented assumption that she couldn't get down 16 floors of unfinished stairs without an elevator. He took 3 seconds to feel the cold and specific anger of that. Then he put it away because it wasn't useful yet. He called Evelyn. She answered on the first ring. "Don't come in," he said, low and even. "I need 10 minutes. Stay in your car, lock the doors, and if anyone approaches the vehicle, drive away and call the police." A pause. Her voice, when it came, was controlled in the way of someone who was frightened and had decided that being frightened was not the dominant response she was going to go with. "What's happening?" "The event isn't an event. The building is staged. I need 10 minutes to change the conditions." "Nolan," a pause. "How many people?" "At least 3 that I've found, possibly more." Another pause, shorter. "Be careful." "I'll call you back," he said, and hung up. He went to the mechanical room on 17. The shaft controls were a panel of breakers and manual overrides, labeled in the standardized construction notation he knew from a decade and a half of facility work, supplemented by the additional logic of having read the building's construction records that afternoon. He found the accessible elevator circuit, confirmed it, and pulled the manual override that locked the elevator in place. Not disabled, locked, elevator car on 16, doors open, going nowhere but also not going to go anywhere without the override being reset. He didn't cut power. Cutting power triggered alerts. Locking the manual override was a maintenance function, invisible to any monitoring system until a technician physically checked the panel. Then he went back to the stairwell, down to 16, and removed the rubber stop from the northeast stairwell door. The door swung outward freely. He placed the stop in his pocket. He checked the south stairwell, the main construction stair, the one that ran from ground to roof, and found it clear on 16. He propped that door open instead, wedging it with a chunk of leftover concrete form tie he found on the floor nearby, because he wanted it open and he wanted it to stay open regardless of what someone might try to do with it in the next few minutes. The man near the south window on 15 had not moved. Nolan came down the main stair and came onto 15 through the south stairwell door, which was not blocked, and crossed the floor in the shadows at the room's perimeter. The man was watching the street below, one hand in his jacket pocket, the particular watchful stillness of someone waiting for a signal. Nolan moved behind him with the specific, unhurried quiet of someone who had done this in harder circumstances than a concrete floor under construction lighting, and he put one hand on the man's shoulder and the other on his jacket collar and walked him firmly but without violence toward the wall, pressing him into it face first with controlled force. "I'm going to take your phone," he said very quietly against the man's ear, "and your keys if you have them. And then you're going to sit on the floor with your hands visible and not move until the people who are coming into this building in about 6 minutes decide what to do with you. Nod if you understand me." The man nodded. He was breathing fast and his body was rigid with the shock of it. Nolan had learned that people in surveillance positions almost never expected contact because they believed themselves invisible. He took the phone. He took a key fob from the man's jacket pocket, which turned out to be for a vehicle, useful for confirming this person had not arrived in a Titan Forge fleet vehicle. He pressed the man down to the floor by the shoulder, met no serious resistance, and left him there. He took the south stair back to 16, came through the door he'd left propped, and crossed to the podium at the north end of the floor before either of the 2 men near the catering setup registered his arrival from the shadows. One of them did, eventually, looked up, startled, the particular freeze of someone whose planning hadn't included this particular variable. "Who are—" "Step away from the elevator," Nolan said. His voice carried in the open space with the same quality that concrete rooms amplify things, flat, clear, no echo softening it. The man who'd spoken went still. The second man turned from the catering table and assessed Nolan with the quick inventory of someone deciding their options, looking at a man in dark work clothes standing between them and the elevator with the kind of settled posture that doesn't advertise itself and doesn't need to. The second man made a decision and moved toward Nolan, which was the decision Nolan had been waiting for, and he let him come most of the way and then moved to meet him inside the range that aggressive people never plan for. And the confrontation ended in about 4 seconds, with the second man sitting on the concrete floor with his wrist held at an angle that made movement inadvisable, breathing loudly through his nose. "I'm not going to hurt either of you," Nolan said to both of them, still at the same quiet register. "I want you to understand that I could, and I'm choosing not to. And I need you to understand the difference because it matters for what happens next." He had them sit. He took their phones. He called Evelyn. "It's clear on 16, he said. "I need you to stay outside the building. Call the police now. Tell them you have evidence of an assault conspiracy at the Meridian Tower and that there are individuals detained on floors 15 and 16. Give them my name as the caller. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said immediately. "Good. Do it now." He hung up and stood in the middle of the 16th floor, in the ambient light coming off the construction fixtures, with 2 men sitting on the floor and the city visible through 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling glass. And he felt the particular stillness that came after a thing had been resolved into something manageable from something that had been, very briefly, something else. One of the men on the floor, the first one, the talker, looked up at Nolan with the expression of someone who had spent enough time around dangerous situations to know when he was in the presence of something that didn't match the profile he'd been given. "They said you were a mechanic," the man said. Nolan looked at him without particular expression. "I am a mechanic," he said. He stood in the window light and waited for the sound of sirens from the street below, which came in 11 minutes, longer than he'd have preferred, but within the range of acceptable. When they came, he went to the south stairwell window and looked down at the street, and he could see Evelyn's dark blue sedan still parked across the road from the building's main entrance, exactly where he'd asked her to stay, the interior light faintly visible through the driver's window. He leaned against the window frame and let out a slow breath that he hadn't entirely been aware he was holding. Below, the sirens grew louder. The city moved around them, indifferent, the way cities always do, full of its own noise and its own urgency, unbothered by the particular small drama of 3 men on a concrete floor 16 stories up and a woman sitting in a car on the street below who was still, by every measure, the CEO of a billion-dollar company, waiting for the space to be safe enough to enter. He thought she'd been waiting for that for a long time, longer than tonight. He thought about what it cost to wait like that. He stayed at the window until the first police units were visible on the street below, and then he straightened up and started walking toward the stairwell, because there were a lot of things that needed to be said to a lot of people in the next few hours, and he'd always preferred to go toward those conversations rather than wait for them to find him. The police took statements for 3 hours. Nolan gave his twice, once to the first officers on scene, once to a detective named Okafor, who arrived 40 minutes later with the particular unhurried precision of someone who had learned that the best interviews happened after the adrenaline left the room. Okafor was mid-40s, wore a coat that had seen better decades, and asked questions the way good mechanics diagnosed problems. Not starting with the most obvious component, but working back from the symptom to find where the real failure had originated. Nolan answered everything directly and without embellishment. He showed Okafor the photos on his phone, the access log, the parking camera screenshot, the tire, the rehabilitation video screen grab, the printed facilities tickets with their closed without action notations. He walked Okafor through the timeline the same way he'd walked Evelyn through it in the East Corridor. What was confirmed, what was inferred, where the gaps still were. Okafor listened, made notes, and at the end looked at the photos one more time with the expression of someone whose evening had become considerably more interesting than anticipated. "You documented all of this as a mechanic," he said. It was not quite a question. "I documented it as someone who works in the building and noticed things," Nolan said. "Most people who notice things would have reported it to HR." "I considered that," Nolan said. "I decided the channels weren't clean." Okafor looked at him for a moment. What did you do before Titan Forge? Navy, Nolan said. 8 years. Okafor wrote something down. He didn't push further, which Nolan appreciated. The 3 men detained on floors 15 and 16 had been transported separately. 2 of them had said nothing beyond requesting attorneys. The third, the man from the 15th floor, the one Nolan had walked to the wall, had been, by the time officers reached him, sitting on the floor with his hands visible exactly as instructed, and had apparently decided that cooperation was his best available option once he understood the scope of what he was sitting inside. He gave a name, Carl Dutton, former private security contractor. He'd been hired, he said, through a series of intermediary contacts that he was now willing to detail. Because he had not signed up, he made clear to the officers, for whatever the actual plan for the evening had been, a claim that Nolan neither confirmed nor disputed, because it wasn't his job to adjudicate Carl Dutton's moral accounting. Evelyn had been interviewed in her car initially, then in the lobby of the building next door once the scene was deemed controlled, with Theo beside her and her attorney on a video call from across the city, a compact, direct woman named Sandra Marsh, who had apparently arrived on the call already informed and already furious, which told Nolan that Evelyn had not waited for the police sirens to start making calls. He didn't see Evelyn again that night until close to 11 p.m., when the scene had thinned to a few officers finishing documentation and Okafor wrapping the last of his notes. She was in the lobby of the adjacent building, Theo standing nearby looking like he'd aged about 3 years since morning, and she looked up when Nolan came through the door with the particular directness she reserved for moments when she was dispensing with whatever social geometry usually padded human interaction. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No," he said. She looked at him for another moment, assessing, confirming that the answer matched the evidence. Then she said, "Sit down," with a gesture toward the chair nearest her. And when he sat, she looked at her tablet for a moment and then set it face down in her lap. "Sandra is filing for emergency discovery on the Titan Forge financial records first thing tomorrow morning," she said. "Based on what your source provided and what tonight establishes about motive, she thinks we have enough for a judge to grant it." "That'll move fast once it's filed," he said. "That's the idea." She paused. "Garrett and Voss are going to know by morning." "Yes." "Which means the next 48 hours are going to be—" She stopped herself. "Complicated." That's one word for it. She almost smiled, the same ghost of it he'd seen in the East Corridor weeks ago. She looked tired, the specific tiredness of someone who had been running on controlled tension for a long time and was now in the first moments of that tension loosening into something that hadn't resolved yet into relief. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right? Your source. The financial information about Vexler and the holding company payments. I'm not going to need to know who it was for the legal filing. Sandra confirmed that. But I want to know if the person is exposed in any way because of what happened tonight." He considered that. It was a more careful question than most people would have asked in her position, at this hour, after this evening. "No," he said. "The information was sourced from public records. The connection between those records is the contribution, not the access." She nodded slowly. "Good." A pause. "Thank you. For tonight. For all of it, actually. Starting with the threshold 3 weeks ago." "The threshold was a building deficiency," he said. "I know that's what you said." She looked at him steadily. "That's not what I'm thanking you for." He held her gaze. It was a direct look, the kind that didn't ask for a response so much as acknowledge that a thing had been said, and both people in the conversation understood what it meant. He nodded once, and she accepted that. He drove home past midnight. Mrs. Calloway's lights were off, but she'd left his key under the mat, and Maya was asleep on the pull-out couch in the living room with a throw blanket half on and the television dark and a library book open on her chest, because Maya always fell asleep reading and always seemed faintly surprised in the morning that she had. He lifted the book off her chest and set it on the side table, and he sat for a moment in the chair across from the couch in the quiet dark. And he thought about nothing in particular for a few minutes, which was the closest he got to rest on nights like this. Then he went home and slept for 5 hours, which was enough. The 48 hours that followed moved with the specific velocity of things that have been kept under pressure for a long time and are now releasing. Sandra Marsh filed for emergency discovery at 8:17 a.m. on Saturday. The judge granted it by early afternoon, citing the documented evidence of criminal conspiracy as sufficient basis for expedited review. By Saturday evening, a forensic accounting firm retained by Evelyn's legal team was in the Titan Forge server room with court authorization, and the quiet, methodical work of pulling 3 years of procurement records had begun. Garrett found out at approximately 3 p.m. Saturday, which Nolan knew because Theo texted him a single line. G just left the building. Didn't look good. Voss found out shortly after, from what Nolan could gather from the fragments of information that moved through the company's informal networks over the following 24 hours. The kind of information that travels fast in large organizations when something significant is happening on the executive floor, and people can feel the pressure differential even without knowing the specifics. Sunday was the quiet before the next thing. Nolan took Maya to a park near their neighborhood because the weather had shifted, the heavy iron sky weather of the past weeks finally breaking into something cleaner, and Maya ran across the grass with the particular abandonment of a child who had been cooped up in school and after-school programs all week and needed to spend energy on open space. He sat on a bench and watched her, and drank bad coffee from a gas station cup, and thought about the forensic accountants in the server room and what they were finding. He thought they were probably finding a lot. He was right. By Monday morning, the first results of the financial review had been summarized in a preliminary report that Sandra Marsh delivered to Evelyn at 7 a.m. Nolan knew this because Evelyn texted him at 7:40 with 4 words. It's worse than 11 million. He read that in his truck in the Titan Forge parking structure, engine idling, and thought, of course it is. The full scope, as it emerged over the following days in increments that Evelyn's legal team managed carefully for both strategic and legal reasons, was a procurement fraud scheme that had been running for nearly 4 years, predating Evelyn's tenure by 2 years, and continuing through her first year of leadership, terminating, abruptly, completely, when her procurement restructuring eliminated Vexlar from the supply chain. The total move through the scheme over 4 years was closer to $23 million, routed through a network of subsidiary invoices, falsified cost allocation reports, and a research and development budget line that had been used as a holding vessel for funds that never went anywhere near research or development. Garrett's consulting payments from the Vexlar adjacent holding company totaled $460,000 over 3 years. Voss's connection was more indirect and more carefully insulated. His brother-in-law's position on the Vexlar board had come with a series of stock options that had appreciated significantly during the years of the inflated contract, a form of compensation that required considerably more forensic attention to establish, but was, according to Sandra Marsh, entirely traceable. There were 2 other executives implicated, not Garrett and Voss's equals, more operational-level managers who had administered the falsified documentation, probably knowing enough to be useful and not enough to feel like genuine partners, which was a common architecture in this kind of arrangement. One of them, a man named Reddick from the finance division, had apparently kept his own records, whether from a self-protective instinct or simple bureaucratic habit was unclear, and those records were, according to Sandra, remarkable in their completeness. The 3 men from the Meridian Tower had retained lawyers. Dutton, the one who'd been cooperative at the scene, was negotiating. The other 2 had gone quiet behind their attorneys, which was standard procedure, and didn't change the forensic picture already assembled. On Wednesday, 5 days after the Meridian Tower, Garrett and Voss were formally placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The notification was delivered by Evelyn's office, not through HR, which she'd decided she couldn't fully trust until the scope of the executive involvement was better understood, but directly, in writing, from the CEO's office, which had the legal authority to issue it. Nolan heard about the administrative leave from Marcus, who appeared at the bay entrance mid-morning with the particular expression he wore when something significant had happened, and he wanted to both discuss it and not be seen as someone who spent his time discussing things. "Garrett and Voss," Marcus said. "On leave. You hear?" "I heard," Nolan said. He was rebuilding a sensor array on a machining unit that had been running diagnostics incorrectly for 3 weeks. "People are saying it's financial, an audit." "People are probably right." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Is this something you knew about? Nolan looked up at him. Marcus was a decent man. He deserved a straight answer. I knew there were things in the building that needed looking at, he said. I looked at them. Marcus processed that. You're a mechanic, he said, not as an accusation, more as someone testing the fit of a piece of information that wasn't quite the shape of the space it was supposed to fill. Yeah, Nolan said, and went back to the sensor array. What he didn't know, until Thursday evening, was that Garrett had spent the 2 days between learning about the investigation and receiving the administrative leave notice making calls, specifically to members of the board of directors, specifically about Nolan. He found out from Evelyn, who called him directly, rather than texting, which she did when the thing she had to say was something she wanted to say rather than write. He was in the truck, picking up Maya from school, and he let it ring until he'd parked and Maya had climbed in with her backpack and settled, and then he told her he needed 2 minutes, and she accepted this with the equanimity of a child who had learned that her father sometimes had 2-minute phone calls, and he stepped out of the truck. Garrett went to 3 board members, Evelyn said. He gave them a full account of your military background, the classified portions, or his version of them. He told them you were a SEAL. He told them you'd been involved in operations that he described as, a pause, morally questionable. He suggested that you'd staged the Meridian Tower situation to manufacture a crisis that would serve your own agenda. Nolan stood beside his truck on the sidewalk outside the school and listened to this. He has no actual access to classified information, Evelyn continued. Whatever he said about your service record, it was inference or fabrication. But the board members he spoke to are people whose first instinct when they're scared is to find an alternative story that makes the frightening thing someone else's problem. Did they believe him? 2 of them are now calling for a full inquiry into your role in the Meridian Tower incident before they'll endorse any further action against Garrett and Voss. A pause. Sandra says it's a delay tactic. She's probably right, but it's a real delay. He thought about that for a moment. He thought about the board members, people he'd never met, people who knew his name only as an explanation Garrett had offered for why the thing happening to him was someone else's fault. He thought about how much easier it was to make a person a problem than to look at the thing the person had found. What do you need from me? He said. Nothing you don't want to give, she said immediately. If your service record is something you've kept private for reasons that matter to you, this isn't Evelyn. He said her first name, which he hadn't before. He heard the slight pause on her end that registered it. What do you need? A longer pause. I think the only thing that stops this delay from becoming a derailment is transparency, she said. I think if your background becomes public, accurately, in context on your terms, then Garrett's version of it loses its power. He looked at the school entrance, where other parents were collecting other children, the ordinary choreography of a weekday afternoon, and he thought about 5 years of a quiet life in a building full of machines, of Maya doing homework at the kitchen table, of a life constructed around the idea that the things he'd done before could stay before. All right, he said. You don't have to. I said all right, he said, not unkindly. I'll figure out the shape of it. Give me a day. He didn't need a day. He knew what the shape was. He just needed to decide if he was willing to wear it again in public, after 5 years of not wearing it, and that decision took him about 20 minutes on the kitchen floor after Maya was in bed, sitting with his back against the cabinet and a glass of water on the tile beside him, and nothing else in the room. He decided. He called Devin Rask at 9 p.m. I need to make my record available, he said, the sanitized version, enough to establish what I did and how I did it without compromising anything still classified. I can put you in touch with the right people for that, Rask said. It'll take maybe 72 hours to have something releasable. I need 60. Of course you do. A pause. Nolan, you sure about this? I'm sure it's the right call, he said. That's not the same thing as being sure about it. No, Rask agreed. It's not. The documentation arrived in 58 hours. It was a 5-page summary prepared by a communications contact of Rask's, who had experience translating military service records into civilian legible language without gutting them of meaning. It described Nolan's 8 years in the Navy in accurate and specific terms, his qualification as a SEAL at 22, his assignment to a hostage rescue unit, the nature of that work in terms broad enough to be public but specific enough to be real. It noted that he had left the service with an honorable discharge after injuries sustained during an operation, without detailing the operation. It noted that he had not traded on his service record or made it the basis of his civilian identity, which the document framed not as concealment, but as a choice about how he wanted to live, which was accurate. Evelyn read it in her office and called him immediately after. "This is," she started and then stopped, and he could hear her choosing the next word carefully. "This is more than I knew. Most people didn't need to know. You ran into a burning building in 4 separate rescue operations," she said. "That's in here. You were part of the team that extracted 11 hostages from a facility with—" She stopped again. "And then you came here and fixed hydraulic presses." "The presses needed fixing," he said. A long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, stripped of the professional register she usually maintained. "I'm sorry that it has to be public." "Don't be," he said. "It was always the truth. I just wasn't using it." She released it the following morning, not as a press statement, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a factual document appended to Titan Forge's formal response to the board inquiry, framed as context for evaluating Nolan's actions at the Meridian Tower. She did not hold a press conference. She did not call journalists. She let the document sit in the legal filing and let it be found, which it was, quickly, because documents like that in legal filings always were. The company's public review pages, which had spent 2 weeks circulating the rehabilitation video and anonymous shareholder letters, now filled with something different. Surveillance footage from the Meridian Tower's lobby cameras, which showed Nolan entering the building alone in dark work clothes, showed the sequence of what had followed, showed him coming down to the lobby with 2 police officers and walking past them to check, first, that Evelyn's car was still across the street. The footage had been released as part of the police department's documentation of the incident, standard procedure, and once it was public, it moved the way things moved when they contained something people weren't expecting to see. What people weren't expecting was the part after the officers arrived, when Nolan had gone back up in the elevator to make sure one of the detained men, the one who'd made an aggressive movement and ended up on the floor, had someone check his wrist, which Nolan had been concerned about, and had waited with him until the paramedics arrived. Nobody had asked him to do that. He'd just done it. That detail, small and unannounced, landed differently than the rest. On the company's internal forum, on the industry channels that had been circulating the rehabilitation video, on the same investor forum where the anonymous shareholder letter had appeared. Titan Forge employees who had spent weeks watching from their workstations while something they didn't fully understand happened in the upper floors, and the executive suite now had a name and a face and a specific, unheroic, human-sized gesture to attach to what had happened. A mechanic who went back up to check on someone who'd just tried to hurt him. Marcus appeared at the bay entrance Thursday afternoon, which was becoming a pattern. "People are talking," he said. "I know," Nolan said. "Good talking. The forum posts and everything. The footage." "I know." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular frankness of someone who had something to say and had decided to just say it, "I didn't know you were... none of us knew." "I know," Nolan said. "Does it bother you that it's out?" Nolan considered this genuinely because Marcus deserved a genuine answer. "Ask me in a month," he said. Marcus nodded. He seemed to understand that this was the honest answer. The board meeting that convened that Friday was different from the one Evelyn had walked into 6 weeks earlier. The same room, some of the same people, but Garrett and Voss were absent, on leave, under investigation, their proxy votes suspended pending the ongoing inquiry. And the 2 board members who had been approached by Garrett with his alternative story about Nolan had, after reading the released documentation, withdrawn their call for a separate inquiry with the particular efficiency of people quietly rerouting away from a position they'd prefer not to be associated with any longer. Evelyn presented for 45 minutes. She presented the preliminary forensic findings, the scope of the scheme, the documentation of what had been done to her building infrastructure, her therapy facility, her rehabilitation footage, her shareholders. She presented it cleanly, without editorializing, which was its own kind of devastating, numbers and access logs and camera angles, laid out in sequence, letting the sequence speak. She also presented a framework for what came next, not a punishment schedule, that was for the legal process to determine, but a structural proposal, an independent financial oversight committee, a new head of corporate security, a third-party accessibility compliance review of every building access point across Titan Forge's 3 facilities. She proposed an anonymous reporting system for employees, not through HR alone, but through an independent external channel, because, she said, what had happened in the past 6 weeks had included multiple Titan Forge employees who had known pieces of what was happening and had not had a clear, safe place to put that information. She didn't mention Nolan by name in that section. She didn't need to. The board voted. The proposal passed. The 2 executives who had approached Garrett's story with interest voted in favor, which was the kind of vote that communicated its own message about where they assessed the wind to be blowing. And Evelyn accepted it without comment because she was pragmatic enough to understand that unanimous support in a room is almost never about pure conviction, and almost always about a combination of conviction and what people think the room expects of them, and the outcome is what mattered. Afterward, Theo found Nolan at the bay. Word moved fast in this building, and said that Evelyn would like to see him if he was available. He washed his hands, which required more time than the invitation probably anticipated, and went upstairs. She was at her office windows when he came in, the city visible behind her, the afternoon light coming in flat and direct the way it did when the sky had finally cleared after weeks of low clouds. She turned when she heard the door. "It passed," she said. I heard." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Sit down, Nolan," and he sat, and she moved her chair to face him rather than positioning herself behind the desk, a small choice that he noticed and understood. "The corporate security division I proposed to the board," she said, "independent of existing HR and executive infrastructure, reporting directly to the CEO. I want you to build it." He looked at her. He had not anticipated this, which was unusual for him. "I'm a mechanic." "You're also the person who documented a criminal conspiracy over 5 weeks using a camera phone and a habit of keeping printed copies of things," she said, "and then went into an unfinished building alone and secured the situation without hurting anyone, and then went back upstairs to check on the person who'd tried to hurt you." A pause. "I'm less interested in your job title than in your judgment." He was quiet for a moment, not from uncertainty, but from the kind of pause that a person takes when they are being offered something real and want to receive it accurately rather than reflexively. "It would take time to build it properly," he said. "I know. I'd need to hire people I trust, from outside the current structure. The budget proposal is in your discretion," she said, "and I still need someone to manage the bays. The machines don't fix themselves." Something in her expression shifted, the small, involuntary shift he'd noticed a few times now, the one that meant she found something genuinely funny and was deciding whether to let it show. This time, she let it show. It was the first time he'd seen her actually smile, not the ghost of one, but the real version, and it changed her face in a way that he stored somewhere and didn't examine. "I'll manage the transition timeline around the machines," she said. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. She extended her hand. He shook it, and her grip was firm and direct, the handshake of someone who meant the thing they were agreeing to, and he met it with the same intention. "One more thing," she said as he stood. He waited. "Your daughter," she said. "Maya. Theo mentioned she makes you lunch sometimes, packs it in a container with her name on it from when she was in kindergarten." He was not sure how to respond to this. "She does." "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Evelyn said. Not coyly, not with the particular performance of someone manufacturing a connection, just directly, the way she said most things when she'd decided something was worth saying. "She is," he said. He drove home that evening on the same route he always drove, past the same streets, the same buildings, the same late afternoon light on the same windows he'd been passing for 5 years. He picked up Maya. She had decided, firmly and without apparent residual uncertainty, that she wanted a turtle. "What happened to the veterinarian plan?" he asked. "I can still be a vet," she said. "The turtle is separate. Where would it live?" She launched into a detailed and surprisingly well-researched explanation of turtle habitat requirements that lasted the rest of the drive home and continued through the process of making dinner, And Nolan listened and answered questions and stood at the stove and thought about Evelyn Sterling's smile and a budget in his discretion and the particular weight of being a person who had spent 5 years reducing himself to the size of his job title and had been seen anyway, through all of it, by someone who paid attention. He thought that was probably what had mattered the most in the end. Not the building, not the Vexler documents, not the parking camera or the forensic accounting. The simple fact of being seen accurately, at full size by someone who was looking. Maya set the table without being asked, which still meant she was working up to something. He waited. "Dad," she said from across the table, with the measured tone of someone making a case. "I've been thinking about the turtle for 3 weeks. That's a long time." "It is," he said. "So it's not an impulse," she said. He looked at her. This small, serious person across the table from him, with her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and her own particular and irreplaceable way of moving through the world, and thought about what it meant to protect something, really protect it, not just stand in front of it, but make the space around it safer than it was before. "We'll go look at turtles Saturday," he said. She absorbed this with the dignity of someone who had known all along she would prevail, but had not wanted to assume. "Okay," she said, and picked up her fork. Outside, the city moved through its evening, and the clouds that had sat over everything for weeks were finally completely gone. The turtle's name was Gerald. Maya had selected him from the third tank at the pet store on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the board vote, choosing him specifically because he was the smallest one and had, in her assessment, the most personality, a quality she determined by the way he extended his neck toward the glass when she pressed her finger against it, which she interpreted as curiosity and which the pet store employee gently suggested might just be a feeding response, a clarification Maya acknowledged and then set aside as irrelevant to her conclusion. Gerald lived in a tank on the kitchen counter. He ate lettuce and the occasional strawberry and moved through his water with the unhurried certainty of a creature that had no particular schedule and no apologies about it. Maya narrated his daily activities with the seriousness of a nature documentary, which Nolan listened to over coffee each morning with a patience that was not performance. He genuinely didn't mind. It was ordinary in the best sense of that word. It was the kind of morning that reminded him why ordinary was worth protecting. The months that followed the board vote were not clean or simple. Nobody's months ever are, and the particular aftermath of a corporate fraud investigation, a criminal conspiracy charge, and a very public dismantling of an executive structure that had been in place for years was not the kind of thing that resolved itself neatly. It unraveled in stages, each stage bringing its own specific complications, and Nolan learned to track them the way he tracked machine diagnostics, not expecting the process to be painless, just expecting it to eventually yield something that could be called fixed. Richard Garrett was formally charged 8 weeks after the board vote. The charge sheet, when it was filed, was longer than most people outside the investigation had anticipated. The forensic accounting had found the full $23 million, and then it had found something else, a secondary arrangement involving falsified safety certifications on 3 component batches delivered to a defense subcontractor, certifications that had been signed off by Reddick and rubber-stamped through Garrett's operations division without the actual testing they claimed to represent. That discovery shifted the charges from financial fraud into territory considerably more serious because the components had been installed in systems used in active contexts. And the gap between what the certification said and what the testing had actually found was the kind of gap that could, under different circumstances, have had consequences that no amount of money could address. Voss was charged separately. His arrangement was cleaner on paper and dirtier in practice. The stock options had been structured with an awareness of what they were attached to, and the forensic team found enough email traffic between Voss and his brother-in-law to establish that awareness clearly. His attorney negotiated, as attorneys do, and the negotiation took months and produced an outcome that Sandra Marsh described to Evelyn as imperfect but real, which Evelyn relayed to Nolan without editorializing, which was how she relayed most things. The 2 operational managers, Reddick and a man named Feltz from the procurement division, cooperated fully in exchange for consideration. Reddick's records, the ones he'd kept out of what appeared to be a combination of self-protection and bureaucratic compulsion, turned out to be the most complete documentation of the scheme's mechanics. Detailed enough that the forensic team said it was the kind of internal record-keeping they usually only found in organized crime cases, which Reddick apparently found neither flattering nor ironic. The three men from the Meridian Tower resolved separately. Dutton's cooperation got him a reduced charge and supervised release. The other two went to trial on a timeline that extended well past everything else and produced an outcome that Nolan followed from a distance without particular satisfaction or vindication, because he'd learned a long time ago that legal outcomes and justice were overlapping concepts rather than synonymous ones, and making peace with that distinction was part of living in the world as it actually operated rather than the world as it should. What he focused on, in the months while all of that was being processed by the legal system, was the work in front of him. Building the corporate security division took longer than he'd estimated, which he'd known it would. Any honest estimate of how long it takes to build something real includes the time spent discovering what you got wrong in the original design. He hired 4 people in the first 3 months, none of them from inside Titan Forge's existing structure. All of them vetted through channels he trusted in ways he didn't fully explain to the HR department and didn't need to, because Evelyn had told him the budget and the authority were his to exercise, and she meant it. 2 of the 4 were former law enforcement, a woman named Carla Brecht, who had spent 12 years in corporate fraud investigation before going independent, and a man named James Osei, who had a background in physical security and the particular quality of someone who noticed things without looking like he was noticing them, which Nolan valued above almost everything else in a person doing this kind of work. The other 2 were younger, one with a cybersecurity background and one who had spent 3 years in facilities compliance and understood building infrastructure at the level that Nolan understood it, which meant they could communicate without translating. He built the anonymous reporting system first, before anything else, because it was the thing that would have changed the most if it had existed 6 months earlier. Not a form on an intranet page. Those got used by people who were already comfortable with formal channels, which was not the population that most needed a reporting mechanism. He worked with the cybersecurity hire to design something that was genuinely anonymous, genuinely independent, routed through an external platform with no Titan Forge IP involvement, with a response protocol that he and Carla managed personally rather than routing through HR. He tested it by asking Marcus to submit a report, and Marcus did, about a coolant handling procedure in Bay 2 that he'd been concerned about for months but hadn't formally reported because the formal reporting path went through a supervisor he didn't fully trust. The coolant procedure got fixed within a week. Word moved through the building the way word always moved, informal and fast, and after that the reporting system started getting used by people who had previously been absorbing their concerns in silence, which is what silence costs in large organizations. Not the absence of problems, but the absence of problems being said out loud. Nolan also spent time on the accessibility audit, more time than was technically required of his role, because it was the thread he'd pulled first and he wanted to see where it ended. He walked every building on the Titan Forge campus with the compliance contractor Evelyn had retained, and what they found was not malice in most cases. It was the ordinary negligence of a built environment designed by people who had not needed to think carefully about what it meant to navigate a space in a wheelchair, which was its own kind of problem, quieter than malice, but broader in its reach. 7 threshold issues across 3 buildings, 2 elevator maintenance protocols that hadn't been updated in 4 years, a parking structure lighting arrangement that was compliant on paper and genuinely inadequate in practice. All of it got fixed. Slowly, because fixing things in large buildings takes budget approval and contractor scheduling and the particular friction of institutional process. But it got fixed, and Nolan documented every item from identification to completion because he'd learned that documentation was the difference between a fix and a fix that stayed fixed. He was at his desk in the new security division office, a converted conference room on the 2nd floor east wing, 2 doors down from where he and Evelyn had first walked the corridor together. When Evelyn appeared in the doorway on a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th month after the board vote. She did that occasionally, appeared without announcement, which he'd come to understand was not an executive power move, but simply how she operated when she wanted to have an actual conversation rather than a scheduled one. "The Hargrove contract renewed," she said. He set down the compliance report he'd been reading. "I heard. They cited the governance reforms as a factor." She moved her chair into the office with the ease of someone in a space they'd decided was comfortable, specifically the independent oversight structure. Clients like to know the house is in order. They like to know someone's actually watching, she said. There's a difference. She set a folder on the edge of his desk. New proposal from the board. They want to replicate the reporting system in the 2 subsidiary facilities. Which ones? Both of them eventually. Waterford first. Carla's availability? She can be there in 2 weeks. I'd want Ose on the physical audit separately. Evelyn made a note on the folder. She had the same handwriting she'd always had. Fast, angular, practical. How's the team settling? Carla's better than I expected, which I expected, he said. The cybersecurity hire is adjusting to the pace. He comes from a faster environment. Will he stay? I think so. He's starting to understand what the work actually is. He paused. It's different than what people picture when you say corporate security. What do they picture? Guards, cameras, response. He looked at the compliance report. The real work is preventive. It's noticing things before they're problems. Most people don't have the patience for that. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the folder. Then, that's what you were doing, before any of this. You were just noticing things. It's a habit, he said. It's more than a habit. She said it without particular emphasis, the way she said things she'd decided were simply true and didn't require ornamentation. It's a way of being in the world, looking at the thing in front of you and taking it seriously. He held that for a moment. Outside the office window, the East Building corridor was doing its afternoon business. People moving between offices. The ordinary visible rhythm of a working building that he'd watched for 5 years from a different floor and now watched from here, the same building seen from a different angle. The rehabilitation schedule, he said. How is that going? The shift was a natural one. They'd developed a way of moving between professional and personal without marking the transition, which had happened gradually enough that he hadn't noticed it happening until it already had. 3 sessions a week now instead of 2, she said. The new facility is better, closer. Progress? Incremental. She said it flatly, without self-pity, but also without performing acceptance of it. My PT tells me incremental is the only kind that holds. I'm choosing to believe her. She's right, he said. Most things that hold started incremental. Evelyn looked at him. There was something in her expression that had been there for a few months now. Something he'd noticed and not named. The way you sometimes don't name things because naming them changes them, and you're not ready for what changing them looks like. Maya asked me about turtles last week, she said. At length. She asks everyone about turtles, he said. She explained Gerald's personality to me for about 12 minutes. That's actually shorter than usual. Evelyn's mouth curved. The real smile again, the one that changed her face. She told me he has trust issues with the thermometer. He does, Nolan said. We're working on it. This was the other thing that had happened incrementally, without announcement. Maya. The first time had been accidental. Nolan had brought Maya to the building on a Saturday when he needed to check something with Carla and the after-school program was closed, and Maya had spent 20 minutes in Evelyn's office while the adults talked and had discovered the small succulent plant on Evelyn's windowsill and asked, with the directness that was becoming her defining characteristic, why it was sitting in a pot that was too small for it. Evelyn had said she hadn't noticed. Maya had said that was the problem with succulents. They didn't complain until it was too late, so you had to check. Evelyn had looked at the succulent for a moment and then at Maya with the expression of someone who had just had something explained to them that they suspected applied to more than one thing, and she'd said, "You might be right," and Maya had accepted this with appropriate gravity. After that, Maya asked about Evelyn, the way she asked about things she'd filed under interesting, not constantly, but with the steady recurrence of genuine curiosity rather than performance. She asked how Evelyn got around the building, and Nolan explained the chair and the modifications and the parts of the building that still needed work. And Maya had listened and said, "That's a lot of things to keep track of," which was such an accurate and uncomplicated way to describe it that Nolan hadn't had much to add. The second time Maya came to the building, she brought a slightly larger pot. She left it on Evelyn's desk with a note in her handwriting that said, for your succulent. It's ready." She had not been asked to do this. She had simply decided it was necessary and done it. Evelyn had texted Nolan that evening. "She repotted it herself. It looks significantly better," he'd replied. "She does that. Fixes things she notices." A pause, and then, "I wonder where she gets that." He hadn't answered that one, which was its own kind of answer. There was an afternoon in the 6th month, late in the year, the light coming in at the low angle of the season, the kind of light that made the city look older and more considered than it usually did, when Nolan was in the parking structure doing a follow-up on the lighting upgrade, checking the new fixtures against the compliance report, and Evelyn came through the accessible entrance on her way back from an off-site meeting and stopped when she saw him on the ladder. "The light on bay C7 still throwing shadows on the far column?" she asked. He looked down at her. "How do you know about bay C7? "I read the compliance reports," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You read the compliance reports?" "All of them." She said it with the faint challenge of someone who finds it slightly amusing that this is surprising. "I'm the CEO of the company. I read the things that come out of my company." He came down the ladder, checked his notes. "C7 is actually resolved. It was the angle of the original fixture. New mount fixed it." "Good." She looked at the ceiling. The new fixtures, the clean even wash of the light on concrete. "Better." "Significantly better," he said, echoing her own word back to her, and she caught it and looked at him sidelong with the expression that meant she'd filed that away. They stood in the parking structure for a moment in the silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the kind of silence that took time to build between people, that didn't arrive without a history of smaller conversations filling in the space around it. The accessible space where her car had been parked the morning he'd first noticed the camera was directly in front of them, and the camera above it was now the right angle, correctly positioned, properly recording. A small thing, one of dozens of small things that were different now from what they'd been. "I've been thinking about something," Evelyn said. She was looking at the camera, not at him. "For a while." "All right," he said. "I don't know the right way to say this, so I'm going to say it the way I would if I were presenting it to the board, which is just directly." "Okay," he said, and waited. She turned to look at him then, and the expression was something he hadn't seen from her before. Not uncertain exactly, because Evelyn Sterling was not a person who did uncertain well, but something honest in a way that moved past the professional register she usually maintained, something that had the quality of a door opening that had been closed for a long time. "I think we've been spending a lot of time working alongside each other," she said, "and I think I'd like to see what it looks like when we're not in a building." He held that. Held it carefully, the way you hold things that matter. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 8 and she has strong opinions about turtles and succulents and the comparative value of different career paths." "I know," Evelyn said. "She's one of the reasons I'm saying this." He looked at her. "That's either the most sensible thing I've heard or the most complicated." "It's probably both," she said. "Usually is." He almost smiled. Didn't quite. "I'd like that," he said. "To see what it looks like when we're not in a building." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded once, with the same decisive quality she brought to board resolutions and compliance reviews. Not small, but not dramatic either, just real. "Good," she said. She drove home. He finished the lighting check. He drove home through the low-angled light and thought about the specific improbability of the thing. Not in a grateful or disbelieving way, just in the way of someone turning an object in their hands and looking at the shape of it. He'd come to this building 5 years ago trying to be smaller than his history. He'd picked a job that required precision and patience and the quiet satisfaction of things that worked correctly. He'd built a small life around a small girl and a schedule and a house that smelled like whatever he'd cooked for dinner, and he'd told himself that was enough. And most days, he'd believed it. He hadn't been wrong, exactly. It was enough. It just wasn't everything. The thing he'd learned in the months since the threshold and the access log and the parking camera and the 16th floor and all the incremental weeks of work that followed was something he hadn't expected to learn from any of it. He'd expected the professional lesson, that attention was protective, that documentation mattered, that the small things you noticed before they became large things were the work, the real work, not the moments of action that happened after the small things had been ignored for too long. But the personal lesson was different. It was this. He'd spent 5 years believing that keeping himself contained was the same as keeping himself safe. That if he didn't take up too much space, didn't let too much of what he'd been or what he could do show, then nothing could reach him in the ways things had reached him before. He'd reduced himself to a job title and a father and a man who kept printed copies of things in a drawer, and he'd called that protection. What he hadn't understood was that you couldn't actually protect the things you loved by making yourself smaller than you were. You could only protect them by being exactly the size you were and using it carefully. That was the discipline, not shrinking, but choosing how you stood, where you stood, what you stood between. He'd learned that from a woman in a wheelchair who had walked into a hostile boardroom without flinching, who had read every compliance report that came out of her company, who had looked at a too small, succulent pot and been willing to hear that she'd missed something obvious, who had kept going, incrementally, because incremental was the only kind that held. Gerald the turtle was eating a piece of strawberry when Nolan came home. Maya was at the table, ostensibly doing homework, but actually watching Gerald with the focused attention she usually reserved for nature documentaries. She looked up when the door opened. "Dad," she said, "Gerald ate the whole piece without stopping. He never does that." Maybe he was hungry. "I think he's getting more comfortable," she said, with the satisfaction of someone whose patience has been validated. He put down his keys and his jacket and sat across from her at the table, and looked at the turtle and the homework and the remnant of a strawberry and his daughter, who was watching a small creature move through a tank with the conviction that what she was seeing was significant, and he thought about what it meant to get more comfortable, how long it took, how gradual it was, how you never noticed it happening until it had already happened, and then you looked back at the distance between where you'd started and where you were standing, and it was larger than you'd thought while you were crossing it. "How was school?" he asked. She launched into it. She had opinions about a history project and an update on the turtle habitat research she was now conducting formally, and a question about whether turtles could recognize faces, which she had a theory about and wanted to test, a theory that involved systematic interaction logging that she described in terms that were more rigorous than her third-grade teacher probably expected. He listened. He answered questions. He made dinner. Later, after Maya was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before he got to it, which was a habit he'd never managed to correct. And he thought about Evelyn and the parking structure and the way she'd said, "I'm going to say it the way I would if I were presenting it to the board," which is just directly. And he thought that was probably the most honest description of how she operated that he could have been given, and that there was something in it that matched something in him that he'd been trying not to notice. He didn't think about the future in large shapes. He never had. The future in large shapes was where people got into trouble, projecting too far, expecting too much, building scaffolding around things that were still establishing their own foundation. He thought about the next week and the Waterford facility visit and Carla's preparation and the compliance extension that needed filing. And he thought about Saturday and whether he'd ask Evelyn if she wanted to come to the park the way he and Maya went, sometimes on weekends when the weather was right. Nothing formal, nothing constructed, just a park with grass and a decent bench and bad coffee from the gas station up the road. He thought she would probably say yes. He thought Maya would explain the turtle research to her, and Evelyn would listen with the same quality she brought to board meetings and compliance reports, fully, without performing attention, actually receiving what she was being given. He thought that was a good enough place to start. Outside, the city ran its nighttime version of itself, all its noise and indifferent motion, and Nolan Cross sat at his kitchen table in a house that smelled like pasta on a Tuesday evening, and he drank his cold coffee, and he let himself sit in the size of his life without trying to reduce it. In the tank on the counter, Gerald moved slowly through his water, unhurried and deliberate, carrying his home on his back the way he always had, going wherever he was going at whatever pace the day required. There is a particular kind of courage that nobody takes photographs of. It doesn't look like anything. It looks like a man showing up to work at 5:40 in the morning because a press is throwing error codes and 23 people will catch grief at the end of the day if someone doesn't fix it. It looks like a woman rolling into a boardroom full of people who have decided she's already finished and saying her first agenda item out loud without letting her voice show what it's costing her. It looks like printed copies of things in a drawer. It looks like a child leaving a pot on a desk with a note that says it's ready. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for the right moment or the right audience. It just keeps choosing. The fix over the complaint, the attention over the avoidance, the full size of itself over the easier smallness. Nolan Cross had spent a long time believing that the quiet life was the safe life, that if he kept his history folded away and his abilities aimed at nothing larger than the machines in front of him, he could protect the things he loved from the weight of what he'd been. What he understood now, sitting at his kitchen table at the end of an ordinary and extraordinary year, was that protection was never about making yourself smaller. It was about knowing exactly what you were and choosing, carefully and deliberately, what you stood between and what you let through. The threshold had been 3/4 of an inch, a building deficiency, a $12 relay, a pressure sensor that read wrong because someone had labeled the wrong variable. Most things that matter start that small. You just have to be paying attention.